Hi, this is Tom Lundquist again at Bluebird Forge, and today I want to talk about making punches and chisels. The first thing to address is what to use for material. I usually use pieces of old coil spring, although I also sometimes use ball peen hammers, which I can buy cheaply at flea markets if the handles are broken. Since I'm going to have to take the handle off to reforge it anyway, it doesn't matter. And you can often find those ball peen hammers for less than $1. You can also search flea markets for used chisels and punches, maybe an old cold chisel that's dull or somebody didn't know how to sharpen it. These can be reforged and the steel used again. Bring the steel to a bright orange temperature and begin to dry out. In this case, I want to make a square punch, so I'm going to draw a square point. Stop forging while the metal is still red so that you don't get cracks in your tool steel. It doesn't matter if you're making a round punch or a square punch, you still need to start drawing to a square point. And again, stop when it gets to red. Continue forging until you have the profile that you want for your punch. If I wanted this one to be round, I would next hammer down the corners to make it octagonal and finally hammer it to round. That way I avoid getting cracks in the steel. Once you have the punch end finished, it's time to finish the batter end, which is the end you'll be striking with your hammer. Make sure that it's straight, and then just chamfer the end a little bit. By chamfer, I mean that we're striking it so that we get a slight taper at the end. This way, as you use it and it begins to spread, it won't mushroom nearly as fast. This also concentrates the force of the blow on the middle of the other end of the punch. Now we can heat treat this if we so desire, and it's usually a good idea to heat treat it, at the very least normalize by heating it up to its bright orange critical temperature and then allowing it to cool in still air. That way you relieve internal stresses that were developed during the forging process. I now have the punch end of this punch at a bright orange temperature. I'm just going to set that aside to cool naturally. Meanwhile, I have another blank in the forge that I'm going to start a chisel. To make a chisel point, we want to taper the stock on two sides only. I do want to keep it from spreading out wider than the original stock, though, in most cases. again, I want to stop forging while it's still red. Get the taper as even as possible on both sides so that when I'm chiseling with it, the chisel doesn't tend to wander off center. And it's not important to get it completely sharp at this point because it's going to have to be ground anyway. As I finish forging the chisel point, I want to make sure that I keep the forged portion of it at the same width as the parent stock, or perhaps just a little bit narrower. That way, if we decide to use this to cut a slot in the middle of a bar, the punch will, or the chisel won't get stuck. Sometimes we use chisels as though they were a punch and then use a drift to open up the hole. See my punching and drifting videos to explain this. I'm just about done with the forging of the chisel end now, so then I'm going to turn it around, heat the other end, and chamfer it as I did for the punch. Notice when I'm doing the chamfer on the end that my hammer is striking at about a 45-degree angle. And this is what gives us that nice clean angle. I'm also making sure that the end of the bar is flattened so that it is at right angles to the length of the chisel. This will help us to chisel straight lines later when we're using the tool. Now it's time to normalize it as we did with the punch. Once the punch has cooled down from normalizing, I use an angle grinder with sandpaper to clean up the sides of it and get it nice and smooth. In this case, because it's a square punch, I want to get it as square as possible. That the end of the punch is square with the long axis of the punch. And also make sure that it's quite flat so that I have a nice sharp corner at the end there. Now I'm going to clean up the chisel with an angle grinder with a wire cut brush mounted on it. I'll do this to remove all the oxide and scale that accumulated on it during the forging procedure. Now, you have to be very careful when you're using one of these cup wire wheels, because those can catch on your shirt if you get too close to it, and then it'll wrap up in your shirt and probably cause you a serious injury. I seriously recommend using a leather apron if you have one, but in any case, be very careful. I'm going to use another angle grinder with sandpaper on it in order to smooth up the chisel point. So I'll clamp it in the vise with the side up, get the other grinder, and at this point I'm just sanding off all the tool marks and I'm smoothing up the bevel and getting it all level and smooth and even. And I will of course have to do this on both sides. I'm also evening up the end of the chisel, and when I do the final bevel, I need to be very careful to make sure that it stays centered, so that when I'm using the chisel later, I'll get a smooth, even cut. At this point, you can see that I've done all the grinding I'm going to do with an angle grinder. I'll finish this up on a belt grinder. You can see there's a little flat on the edge of the chisel there. And you can do it if you don't have a belt grinder, you can do it with a file and finer grits of sandpaper until you're happy with the finish. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. As always, don't forget to like and share, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.